Hi everyone. This is going to be the second to last lecture. We only have one more after this, which is going to be the review for your final exam. But this is going to be the second to last lecture for the Kinesiology 376 class, the undergrad biomechanics class. And for this lecture, we're going to be talking about the neural mechanisms of control. Essentially, we're going to be kind of going into the central nervous system and the characteristics of that and the structures and kind of some of the concepts that are used and needed for kind of normal human motion. We already talked a little bit about variability, so kind of keep that in mind when we're looking at these neural mechanisms. Obviously, these are going to have a little bit of complexity to these. So, some basics. There are two parts of the nervous system as far as we are concerned. There's the central nervous system, which is your brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. This is the nerves carrying info to, which we consider to be afferent or afferent, or away, efferent. Good way of memorizing that, away, efferent, exit, okay? So away from, which would be our efferent nerves and our efferent signals from the CNS, our brain and spinal cord, okay? Our central nervous system does most of the heavy work as far as processing, and our peripheral nervous system deals more or less with the transmission and communication between, our central nervous system and our limbs, our organs, whether it's the reproductive system, the cardiovascular system, the pulmonary system, endocrine system. That's our PNS's job, okay? So the transmission of information involves ascending and descending pathways. Our ascending pathways are our sensory pathway. These deal with the senses, either from our eyes, ears, taste buds, anything like that. That's our sensory pathway. And our descending pathway is our motor pathway. So the signals from our brain and spinal cord that are directing movements go through our descending pathway to our peripheral nervous system. But not all nerve impulses make it to the brain. These are our reflexes. These are involuntary actions. When you touch a hot surface, that does not need to be interpreted through your brain. That's a reflex action. That's where we consider our reflex arc, okay? This is where we have the receptor that's in our peripheral nervous system, goes to our sensory neuron, into an integration sensor within our peripheral nervous system, then back to, immediately skips the ascending pathway to the brain and spinal cord and butts out to a motor neuron that has our effector or a response. So that if you touch something really hot, you get stung by a bee, anything like that, it doesn't need to be processed by the brain. So you move very, very quickly and take your hand, hopefully you take your hand off the hot plate or stove. So let's look at kind of the structure of our brain. We have our cerebellum right here. This is what's kind of the classical brain. This is kind of the more intrinsic kind of, this deals with your vision, your thought processing, and like that. And we have our brain stem right here. This leads into our spinal cord. And then we have our cerebellum. This deals, we have, our occipital lobe here, but we have our cerebellum that kind of helps us maintain balance, okay? Generally, we look at our cerebral cortex of our cerebrum. This contains our primary motor cortex, our primary somatosensory areas, our taste areas, secondary somatosensory area. Our occipital lobe is our visual area. So we have lots of parts in this. You won't need to know every part, but you should be kind of comfortable that if I say, well, what is the premotor cortex, saying, well, it's in the part of the frontal brain of the cerebrum. In our cerebral cortex, we have our different sensory areas, our primary and secondary somatosensory area. And then we have our visual areas, our vision areas right here. This is this is one of the things is usually if somebody gets hit really hard in the back of the head or something like that, they start seeing stars or spots, something like that. That's because there's been damage to the visual cortex of the brain here. Then we have our motor areas in the kind of anterior part of our brain. We have our primary motor cortex and our premotor cortex. Primary motor cortex is dealing with our precise muscle control. Our premotor cortex organizes and coordinates these movements. Then we have the associated areas or association areas. These are used to interpret and direct either the sensory areas and our motor areas so that it can make sense when it's delivered to our peripheral nerves. This occurs in our prefrontal cortex. These are the cognition functions and emotional reactions. This is one of those things, and it's more or less a myth, but if you've ever heard of the story of Phineas Gage, Phineas Gage was a railroad worker back in the early 1900s, I think. And the story goes that he was working on the railroad. He was putting in railroad ties to nail down the railroad tracks. And they used blasting caps. They used little mini explosives to drive that in there. There was an accident in which the blasting cap went off prematurely and shot a railroad spike through his head, and it went through the prefrontal cortex. It didn't kill him, however. He lived, not a full life, but he lived many years even after that injury of having a railroad spike go through his prefrontal cortex of his brain. But the myth goes that after that happened, he became, he wasn't as bright, he became kind of mean, he swore a lot, he started drinking a lot, and that kind of led to, well, maybe those emotions were damaged by the railroad spike. It's a bit of a myth, though, is if you actually look into the story, is he was kind of a jerk before all that happened. So, I'm sure the railroad spike didn't help, and the magnitude of his meanness may have been enhanced, but it's a little bit of a myth if you actually look at the story and look at the person, is he was kind of a jerk before all that happened too, so it might not have been just the railroad spike itself. So, when we look at this, how do we successfully move through our environment? We talked a little bit about this in our variability lecture, but remember our environment is complex. So we use all 5 senses to help us navigate our environment. So how is this information detected? We have our 5 senses. We have vision, your eyes, depth perception. Proprioception is the ability to detect or understand our limb and our body's position and posture in space. Our auditory system, our ears, especially our inner ear, helps with balance. Our olfactory system, our sense of smell, and our sense of taste. Those are our 5 senses. Obviously, if you've seen the movie Sixth Sense, it doesn't really exist. So we're going to look at our 5 senses. So our vision, this detects information outside the body. We consider an exteroceptor. It gives us information about our visual environment. It helps with our depth perception. When we look at, we have 2 eyes. We have eye here, eye here. They're looking out like this. Actually, what is this? Our eyes look at this way and then look at this way, and they see different distances so that we can judge our depth perception. And then we have our retina and visual nerves in the back, and we have our brain here. They cross over the brain like this, okay, to our visual cortex in the back of our brain, or occipital lobe. So they actually cross paths in the middle. And that helps with our depth perception, be able to kind of interpret our world in kind of a 3-dimensional way. Then we have our proprioceptors. Okay, our proprioception. This detects information inside the body and the body's position and movement. So this is why you can close your eyes and touch your nose. You can put your head back and touch your nose. This is one of the things, that if people that are driving drunk get pulled over, this is one of the tests the police might make them do, is we're looking at, is their proprioception impaired because they drank too much? Another thing they might look at when they have you follow a flasher or something like that, even your vision, the muscles in your eye become a little impaired. And we'll start seeing that if you can't really move your eyes smoothly from side to side, they'll kind of quiver, move back and forth, and like that. That's due to simply alcohol inhibiting the acetylcholine. If you already took physiology, it inhibits acetylcholine, so it messes with kind of the muscle function and motor pathways, especially at your eye. So that's where we start looking at that, and that's kind of one of those telltale signs somebody's drank too much or there's been some damage to the nervous system as well. So vision, it's one of our most dominant senses, and it can override other senses. Basically, it's so dominant that it kind of starts controlling. It can actually overcome our proprioceptive senses, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So when we look at this is a big thing when we're looking at virtual reality. Okay, this is kind of one of the larger problems in virtual reality is we see motion sickness occurring. This is where in the virtual reality kind of interface, your body is moving. So even though you're not moving, your vision thinks you're moving, and because it starts to override the proprioceptive system, this kind of leads to kind of an imbalance in signals. This is one of the big things we start seeing people experience vertigo, they get dizzy, they may become nauseous. This is one of the big kind of motion sickness things when we look at people in virtual reality. One of the big ones, one of the things in our VIR lab, we have a program that it simulates you're walking on a tightrope in a really tall building, and people, especially if they're scared of heights, will feel that they're actually there. Their vision system is overriding all their other senses. Okay, so this is one of the big things we look at in virtual reality, and has led to many studies trying to understand how vision helps the control of motion. Okay, how do we use our visual systems to kind of direct our motion control? So how does light get into the muscles? Remember, muscles don't act on their own. They need nerve impulses. So if we're looking at vision, how does that light from vision direct the action of our muscles? So first, light rays enter the eye and stimulate our photoreceptors. These are our rods and cones, okay? The rods in our eye detect dim light as far as shapes and movement. And then our cones detect our bright light. So they help with color and the actual shapeness of certain objects, okay? These are our ambient and focal vision. So our ambient vision deals with the where of an object. Our focal vision, so when we focus on something, it deals with the what of it. So we know we can detect the position of something, but we might not be able, but can we focus and determine what it really is? Okay, so let's talk about vision and how it helps in sports performance. There is a very good video which I would highly, highly suggest you watching. The link is right here, called The Quiet Eye. This is where we start looking at basketball players that shoot free throws. Are they really looking at the backboard of the net when they're shooting this? Or are their eyes almost acting autonomously? So they're able to judge the distance from where they are to the basket and be able to almost autonomously calculate what angle they should throw the ball at to get a basket. So relating to vision, write down exactly how you would teach someone to putt. What would you tell them to look at before, during, and after their swing? If they have to keep all this information in their head, does that make it harder to swing? Do they give like information overload? Same thing with a free throw. So once again, this link right here is a very, very good link to kind of learn about the quiet eye. What about the ability to avoid or intercept an object? This is imperative in activities of daily living and sporting activities as well. You're walking on the sidewalk on campus, not lately, but hopefully soon, and you have to kind of actively avoid other people on the sidewalk. Football players have to be able to judge the distance of a ball so they can either catch it or intercept it. This is where we start looking at tau, T-A-U. Tau is an optical variable that defines the time to contact. So we're able to judge with our depth perception where an object is and understand how it's moving and how we are moving so that we can detect the time to contact with that object. This was developed by David N. Lee and colleagues, and they have shown that tau is used to control movement in a wide range of activities. Either when you're driving your car, being able to detect when you should apply the brakes. If you're any sort of sports, especially if you're doing long jump skiing, is being able to detect how fast that ground is getting back to you so you can prepare for landing. In gymnastics, how high are you from the trampoline? Can you complete that second tumble? And even we look at birds and them being able to hunt. These are egrets right here, and they are very good at determining how far they are above from the water and being able to detect the distance to the fish they're trying to catch when they enter into the water. So back to our original question. How do we successfully move throughout the environment? As in, how is this information detected? Remember from our variability class, we routinely traverse a very complex environment with hopefully ease, sometimes without even thinking about it. So how is this information detected besides just our vision? The process of directing attention to the appropriate visual information is called visual search. When scanning the environment, we often fixate on many different objects, and this is used to pick up relative information. Hopefully you watched that quiet eye video. It was a little bit too long to kind of watch through this PowerPoint. It'd be a lot of silence and everything like that, so I hope you've watched it on your own time because it's kind of important. But what was the point of their training technique? So let's look at this. A novice does not know where to focus their attention. This leads to poor performance. An expert, however, knows to focus where and how to focus their visual attention prior to their activity. So I kind of mentioned this in the movement variability, but a batter really has, I think, roughly 0.15 seconds to decide where to swing. So if they're about to get pitched to, do they really have time? And usually, if we're looking at fastball pitches, those are pitched at a roughly the high 90 per hour mile range, and there's only 60 feet and 6 inches for that ball to get there, so it gets there quick. They don't have time to wait and see how the ball is going to behave. So they may they're not looking at the ball, they look at how the pitcher is moving to determine whether to swing or not. It's the difference between a novice and an expert. They may have a better fixation point than a novice. A novice has a very large fixation point. They have to process way too much information. Versus an expert that knows, I need to look here and only here. So it helps with increasing the time they have whether to decide to swing or hold off. What does all this mean if you're looking at teaching and coaching? So this is kind of a motor control concept, which you're either have already taken a motor control class or are going to take a motor control class. But this is used to direct So you direct your students or athletes with visual attention to the information-rich areas of the environment. You should provide ample learning experiences when task-relevant cues are provided. Allow the performer to explore and find these information cues. Don't just tell them, look at this, look at this, look at this. Allow them to kind of experiment. Give them only feedback that's useful. Don't try to overload them with feedback. So you might model the movement. You can guide the practice. You can provide visual feedback. But you don't want to overload them. You don't want to give them more information than is really needed. They are not playing against robots. So you have to provide variability within the practice session to the performer so the performer can act in a variety of settings. Other than vision, what was the other major information source? Our proprioception. When we look at this is, yes, smell, taste, and hearing are important, but kind of when we look at movement, our vision and proprioception are the major information sources. So how does proprioception differ from vision? It provides information from inside the body, where our eyes don't see. Where does this information come from? The big ones are muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and tendons. Our Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles detect the tension at our tendons and within our muscles to determine how far stretched or contracted a muscle may be. A Golgi tendon organ detects the amount of tension within the tendon of a muscle, and it directs the muscle to relax if that tendon becomes too much. Our muscle spindles detect tension and pressure within the muscles themselves and delivers a contraction response if either of those get too big or too small. So receptors in the muscles, tendons, and joints, especially within our inner ear, provide internal information about the movement. Specific to muscle stretching is sensed by our Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles. Okay, this might be extremely important for the exam. Some other receptors in your vestibular system. This is your inner ear. We have the otolithic organs. These detect linear acceleration, and the semicircular canals of your inner ear detect angular acceleration. Then we have our joint receptors as well that detect acceleration as well. These respond to pressure, acceleration, deceleration, and strain. This is why, if you wanted to, you could close your eyes and hopefully walk forward. What if we lose one of our senses? Okay, so there's a case of Ian Waterman, lost proprioception due to a virus at age 19. He had to relearn to control activities using only visual control. Okay, it is possible, but usually when we look at this would it have been better if he lost his vision earlier? Maybe he would have been able to learn how to use just visual information better, because the brain begins to stop developing after age around 21, 22. Similar to when a person goes blind later in life and must relearn to control movement only through proprioception, only through hearing. So yes, the brain can adapt. So if we look at a healthy functioning nervous system, we have our visual information, our proprioceptive information, and just other sensory information, our hearing, smell, taste. This leads to a more successful movement. What if you lose one of these? What if you lose vision? You're left with only these other two areas of information. So we do see a decrease in the amount of successful movement, but you can learn, so that we do see it can get back to normal, or sometimes even better. So if you lose vision, the system reorganizes and relies more on the other sensory systems. These two take a greater load so they can provide an optimal amount of information for the successful movement. So what is the best way to improve Shaq's free throw percentage? Blindfold him. He doesn't play anymore, but if you remember, if you're old enough to remember when he was playing, or you watched any videos, he was not a very good free throw shooter. It wasn't part of his game. So they tried many things. One thing they did try is, what if we just blindfold him? And they actually did find it did help with his game a little bit. He learned to stop relying so much on his visual senses. So let's wrap this lecture up and we'll talk about kind of the teaching coaching challenge. This is going to be very hard for you, but once again, is if you've got some roommates, you've got a brother, sister, dad, mom, boyfriend, girlfriend, dog. If your dog's up for, you haven't played with him in a while and he's getting kind of bored. Using your newfound knowledge of how visual and proprioceptive information is used to control movement, describe how you would teach a novel skill to a 5th grader. Practice this out on a brother, sister, your dog, boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, husband, anybody that you have access to. This might be important for your final exam, okay, where there may be a short essay question of how would you teach a movement to somebody, okay? You may be given your choice on the skill that you're trying to teach. So understand the reorganizing of following How about this? How can we determine how each system contributes to successful locomotion? Good science would say perform the activity with all the systems intact. Then we manipulate each system one at a time and see how the performance changes. One of the things we do in the Veer Lab, we have what's considered the sensory organization test. This is a very expensive piece of equipment where the person stands on a force plate and they look at kind of a painting on a wall, and they're in a harness. First, we have them just try to stand as still as they can looking at this picture. Then we have them try as still as they can with their eyes closed and see how that changes their balance. We're testing their visual component. Then they stand with their eyes open, but the floor moves. So now we're looking at their vestibular and somatosensory system. Then we have them close their eyes while the floor moves again. Then we have them close their eyes or open their eyes while the surroundings move. Then we have them open their eyes while their surroundings move and the floor moves. So we're slowly manipulating one of these systems to see if there's any damage or any impairment in one of those. So that's how we manipulate these systems. For vision, we can use virtual reality or the SOT. Proprioception, we can use muscle tendon vibration. For a vestibular system, we can use electrical stimulation as well. Okay, there's lots of tools we can use. So keep these in mind for possibly an essay question on the final. So this is the last true lecture of the semester. Once again, I hope that these have been helpful. I know it's harder to do this away from a classroom where it's easier to ask questions. You can stop me while I'm talking. You might see my flailing hand movements when I'm trying to explain something. So it's a little bit harder, and I understand that, but I hope these have been helpful for you. I've already sent out an email by the time you're watching this that my office hours have changed, and please, if any of this is difficult, please get in touch with me. We can do a personal Zoom meeting. We can talk over office hours before you take your final exam, because that's the last exam. I want you guys to all do well. So I hope this was helpful, and obviously if you have any questions, please get in touch with me. Goodbye.